The drive up the coast of Maine took 4 hours. Maya gripped the steering wheel of her small car as the thick morning fog rolled off the ocean and covered the winding road. She passed the small town center of Camden and drove higher into the hills. The pine trees grew taller and closer together here, blocking out the pale sunlight. Finally, the road opened up to reveal a massive stone estate. It sat on the edge of a cliff, looking out over the gray water. It did not look like a cozy home. It looked like a fortress. Maya parked her car on the wide gravel driveway. She grabbed her small travel bag and walked up the wide stone steps. Before she could even knock, the heavy front door swung open. A woman in a neat gray dress stood there. She had kind eyes but a very tight, nervous smile. "You must be Maya," the woman said, stepping aside to let her in. "I am Martha. I take care of the house. Please, follow me. He is waiting in the study." Maya stepped inside. The air in the hallway felt 10 degrees colder than outside. The floors were black marble, and the walls were covered in dark wood panels. There were no photographs, no flowers, and no signs of life. The silence in the house was heavy. It felt like the entire building was holding its breath. Martha led her down a long corridor and stopped in front of a pair of tall oak doors. She knocked twice, then opened one side and motioned for Maya to go in. Maya walked into the room. It was a large library with books reaching all the way to the high ceiling. A large desk sat in the center of the room. A man sat behind it, looking over a stack of papers. Maya stopped and stared for a second. The man had stark white hair that fell neatly around his face. His skin was incredibly pale, almost like white marble. He wore a simple but very expensive dark suit. When he looked up, his eyes were a pale, clear gray. He did not look scary, but he commanded the room without saying a word. This was Caspian, the vampire king of the eastern region. He managed peace and business for his kind, but right now he just looked like a very tired man. "Have a seat," Caspian said. His voice was calm and smooth, but it held no warmth. Maya sat down in the leather chair across from him. She kept her hands folded in her lap. "Martha told me you have experience working in private homes," Caspian said, closing the folder on his desk. "I will be direct. I do not need a chef to impress guests. I do not host parties anymore. I need someone to feed my father, Orion." Maya nodded slowly. "Does he have specific dietary needs?" Caspian looked away for a moment. He looked out the large window at the foggy ocean. "My mother, Lyra, passed away 6 months ago. She was human, my father is not. But they shared a life and they shared meals. Since she died, he refuses to take his blood substitutes. He refuses to eat any human food. He just sits in his room. I have hired different chefs in the last 3 months. Some made high-end human cuisine. Some brought rare blood delicacies. He sent every single tray back untouched." Maya looked at the desk. She noticed a silver picture frame turned face down on the wood. "Why do you think he sent them back?" she asked softly. Caspian frowned. The question seemed to catch him off guard. "Because he has given up," Caspian said flatly. "He wants to fade away. It is a common thing for our kind when we lose a mate. We just stop." "Food is not just calories," Maya said, keeping her voice steady. "It is comfort. It is a memory. Maybe the other chefs were trying to show off their skills instead of cooking. For him." Caspian studied her face for a long time. His gray eyes searched hers, looking for something. Finally, he let out a short breath. "The kitchen is fully stocked. Your room is down the hall from it. The pay is transferred to your bank on the first day of every month. The only rule is that you do not bother him in his room. You leave the food at the door." "I accept the job," Maya said. Caspian stood up. He was very tall. He reached across the desk to shake her hand. His skin was completely cold, like he had just walked in from the snow. "Welcome to the estate, Maya. I hope you have better luck than the others." Maya woke up at 5 o'clock the next morning. Her room was small but comfortable, located right off the main kitchen. She put on a clean white apron and walked into her new workspace. The kitchen was massive. It had 3 large ovens, 2 wide refrigerators, and endless rows of shiny copper pots hanging from the ceiling. But just like the rest of the house, it felt totally empty. It smelled like bleach and cold steel. It did not smell like a kitchen. Martha walked in a few minutes later, carrying a bundle of fresh towels. "Good morning," Martha said, setting the towels on the counter. "Caspian takes a cup of warm water with a single drop of iron supplement at exactly 7 o'clock. He drinks it in his study. And Orion?" Maya asked, opening one of the large refrigerators. It was packed with expensive cuts of meat, imported cheeses, and perfect, unblemished vegetables. Martha sighed and shook her head. Do not worry too much about Orion, dear. Just put something on a plate and leave it by his door at noon. He will not touch it. He has not eaten a real meal in half a year. It breaks my heart, but there is nothing we can do. Maya did not agree with that. She closed the refrigerator. She did not want to use the expensive steaks or the fancy truffles. She walked over to the dry pantry. She found a bag of simple yellow onions, a bulb of garlic, and some rough, dusty potatoes. She carried them to the cutting board. She wanted to make something that smelled like a real home. She grabbed a heavy knife and started chopping the onions. The rhythmic sound of the knife hitting the wooden board echoed through the large kitchen. It was the first sign of real life in that room. Maya turned on the stove and poured a splash of olive oil into a heavy iron pot. She tossed the onions and garlic in. Within minutes, the sharp, warm smell of cooking garlic filled the air. It was a simple, common smell, but it pushed back the coldness of the house. She peeled and diced the potatoes, throwing them into the pot with some vegetable broth and a pinch of dried thyme. She let the soup simmer on low heat for 3 hours. The warm scent drifted out of the kitchen and into the main hallway. When the soup was thick and creamy, she poured it into a plain white bowl. She set the bowl on a wooden tray, added a silver spoon, and placed a folded white napkin next to it. Maya carried the tray out of the kitchen. She walked up the grand staircase. The stairs were covered in a thick red carpet that silenced her footsteps. She reached the top landing and walked down the long, dark hallway. Orion's door was at the very end. It was made of thick, dark wood and was tightly shut. Maya felt a little nervous. She set the tray down on the floor right outside the door. She stood up and knocked softly on the wood twice. Mr. Orion, she called out gently, my name is Maya. I am the new cook. I made you some warm potato soup. It is nothing fancy. It is just meant to warm you up. She waited. There was no sound from inside the room. The silence felt thick and heavy. You do not have to eat the whole bowl, Maya added, keeping her voice low and calm. Just try a little bit. I will come back for the tray later. Maya turned around and walked back down the stairs. She spent the rest of the afternoon cleaning the already clean kitchen, wiping down the counters, and familiarizing herself with the cabinets. When the clock on the wall read 3 o'clock, she wiped her hands on her apron and went back upstairs. She walked down the hallway, expecting to see a full, cold bowl of soup. She reached the door and bent down to pick up the tray. Then she paused. The soup was cold now, but the surface of the thick liquid was broken. The silver spoon was no longer resting on the napkin. It was sitting inside the bowl. Maya looked closely. The bowl was not empty, but a distinct portion of the soup was gone. He had eaten a few spoonfuls. Maya smiled to herself. It was not a huge victory, but it was a crack in the wall. The small victory with the soup gave Maya a new sense of purpose. But she knew she could not just serve potato soup every single day. She needed to know more about the people who used to live here before the grief took over. The next morning, after making Caspian his warm iron water, she decided to do some real digging. Martha was busy dusting the library, so Maya had the kitchen to herself. She opened every cabinet, feeling the back corners. She found expensive blenders that looked brand new and sets of crystal glasses that had never been touched. Then, she knelt on the floor and opened the very bottom drawer near the pantry door. It was stuck. Maya pulled hard with both hands, and the drawer popped open. It was full of old appliance manuals and loose pieces of string. Maya reached into the back of the drawer. Her fingers brushed against something covered in fabric. She pulled it out. It was a thick notebook covered in faded floral cloth. The edges were worn, and the spine was loose. Maya stood up and placed it on the counter. She opened the cover. The pages were filled with neat, cursive handwriting. It was a recipe book. Maya turned the pages carefully. This was not just a list of ingredients. It was a diary of a life. The handwriting belonged to Lyra. Next to a recipe for beef stew, Lyra had written, "Caspian hates carrots. Cut them very small so he does not notice them." Maya smiled. She turned another page and found a recipe for baked apple bread. The note in the margin read, "Orion's favorite. He says the cinnamon covers up the smell of the damp Maine woods. Bake this when he is stressed about the regional meetings." The pages were stained with drops of old vanilla extract and smudged with flour. This book was the heart of the house. Caspian had probably ordered Martha to hide it away because it hurt too much to look at it. But Maya knew that hiding from a memory only gave it more power to hurt you. She decided right then what she was going to do. She was going to cook Lyra's recipes. She gathered the ingredients for the baked apple bread. She peeled 6 red apples, the skin curling off the knife in long, thin strips. She chopped them into small cubes and tossed them in a bowl with brown sugar and a heavy amount of cinnamon. She mixed the flour, butter, and eggs, blending them together until the dough was smooth. She folded the spiced apples into the batter. Maya poured the mixture into a baking pan and slid it into the hot oven. She set the timer for an hour. Then she sat on a stool and waited. 20 minutes later, the magic started to happen. The heat from the oven released the sharp, sweet smell of cinnamon and baked apples. The scent grew stronger and stronger. It escaped the kitchen, floating down the main hall, creeping up the grand staircase, and seeping under the heavy wooden doors. It was a smell of warmth, of safety, of a Sunday afternoon with a family. Martha walked past the kitchen door and stopped dead in her tracks. She closed her eyes and inhaled deeply. "Oh, my word!" Martha whispered, stepping into the kitchen. "That smell. I have not smelled that in this house since she died." "It is her apple bread," Maya said, looking at the oven. Martha shook her head slowly. She looked a little scared. "You are very brave, Maya. I do not know how Caspian will react to this. He might fire you on the spot." "If he fires me, then he fires me," Maya said calmly. "But I have to try." The timer buzzed. Maya pulled the hot golden bread out of the oven. She set it on a wire rack to cool. The smell was now overwhelming in the best way possible. She cut a thick slice, placed it on a small plate, and set it on the wooden tray. She carried the tray upstairs. Her heart beat a little faster this time. She set the tray down by Orion's door, knocked twice, and spoke clearly. "Mr. Orion, I found something in the kitchen today. I followed the instructions exactly. I hope it brings you a little bit of comfort." She did not wait. She walked back downstairs. She needed to start preparing dinner, and she knew Caspian would be home soon. She just hoped the smell of the apples would be enough to break through the thick fog of grief upstairs. Caspian pulled his black car into the driveway just as the sun dipped behind the tall pine trees. He stepped out of the car, adjusting the cuffs of his dark suit. He had spent the entire day in town, meeting with local leaders to ensure the treaty between his kind and the humans remained quiet and secure. He was tired. His shoulders felt heavy. He walked up the stone steps and pushed the heavy front door open. He stepped into the foyer and stopped. He dropped his leather briefcase on the marble floor. It landed with a loud thud. Caspian stood perfectly still. He closed his eyes and breathed in. The air was thick with the scent of baked apples, brown sugar, and cinnamon. It hit him like a physical blow to the chest. It was the exact smell of his childhood. It was the smell of his mother standing by the stove, humming a low tune while the rain hit the windows. A wave of memories crashed over him, memories he had locked away in a dark box in his mind just so he could keep functioning as the king. The cold, controlled mask he wore every day slipped off his pale face. He looked vulnerable. He looked like a son who missed his mother. While Caspian stood frozen in the hallway, a sound broke the silence. It came from the top of the stairs. It was the slow, drawn-out creak of a door opening. Caspian snapped his eyes open and looked up. Maya, who had walked out of the kitchen to see if he was home, also stopped and looked up. A figure stepped out of the shadows on the top landing. It was Orion. He wore a loose gray shirt and dark pants. His white hair was messy and uncombed. His skin was pale and he looked incredibly frail, as if a strong gust of wind from the ocean could knock him over. But he was out of his room. He stood there, holding onto the wooden banister with a tight grip. His dark eyes scanned the hallway below. He saw Caspian, but his eyes did not stay on his son. He looked past him, following the invisible trail of the cinnamon scent. Orion took a step down the stairs, then another. He moved very slowly, his joints stiff from months of sitting in a dark room. "Father," Caspian whispered. His voice was choked with emotion. He took a step toward the stairs, raising a hand to help the older vampire. Orion did not answer. He just kept walking down, step by step. When he reached the bottom floor, he did not turn toward the formal dining room or the grand library. He walked straight toward the kitchen. Caspian and Maya followed him in total silence. Orion walked into the bright kitchen. He saw the loaf of apple bread sitting on the counter. He saw the thick slice sitting on the plate, on the small wooden table in the corner. He walked over to the table and slowly sat down on the simple wooden chair. Maya moved quickly and quietly. She poured a glass of cold water and set it next to the plate. She stepped back and stood near the sink. Caspian stood in the doorway, unable to move. Orion stared at the slice of bread. His hands trembled slightly as he reached out. He picked up the bread with his fingers. He brought it to his face and closed his eyes, breathing in the scent. A single tear slipped out from under his eyelashes and rolled down his pale cheek. He took a bite. He chewed slowly. No one spoke. The only sound in the room was the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. Caspian watched his father eat. He saw the tight lines of pain around his father's mouth soften just a little bit. He saw a man tasting a memory and finding a tiny reason to keep going. Caspian looked across the room at Maya. She was watching Orion with a gentle, respectful expression. Caspian realized right then that this human woman had done something all his power and money could not do. She had brought his father back from the edge. The house changed after that day. The shift was not loud or dramatic, but it was real. The heavy silence that used to choke the halls slowly faded away. Orion did not retreat to his dark room. The next day, right around noon, he walked down the stairs and entered the kitchen. He took a seat at the small wooden table in the corner. Maya was standing at the counter, chopping fresh vegetables for a chicken stew. She looked over and smiled at him. "Good afternoon, Mr. Orion," she said, continuing to chop the carrots. "Good afternoon, Maya," Orion replied. His voice was still a bit raspy, but it was clearer than before. He sat quietly and watched her work. He watched the way she moved around the kitchen, grabbing a pinch of salt here, stirring a pot there. After a few days of this routine, Orion started to talk. "Lyra never used a wooden spoon for the stew," Orion said one afternoon, pointing a long, pale finger at the spoon in Maya's hand. "She said the wood absorbed too much of the garlic flavor. She always used a metal ladle." Maya smiled and swapped the wooden spoon for a metal one. "Thank you for the tip," she said. "I want to get it exactly right." Orion nodded. And then he kept talking. He told Maya about the day he met Lyra in a small bookstore in town. He told her about how Lyra used to burn the toast on purpose because she liked the crunch. Maya just listened. She did not interrupt him. She did not ask probing questions. She provided a safe, warm space for him to let the memories out. Every dish she cooked from the hidden notebook unlocked another story. Caspian noticed the change too. He found himself leaving his office in town earlier and earlier. He would drive back to the estate, take off his suit jacket, and walk straight to the kitchen. At first, he just leaned against the doorframe, watching Maya and his father talk. But slowly, the invisible barrier between the vampire king and the human cook began to break down. One rainy Thursday evening, Maya was facing a massive pile of potatoes that needed peeling for a large shepherd's pie. Orion was sitting at the table, telling a story about a time he and Lyra got lost driving in the mountains. Caspian walked into the kitchen, listened to the story for a moment, and then walked over to the drawer. He pulled out a vegetable peeler. He stood next to Maya at the counter, picked up a potato, and started peeling. Maya looked up at him, surprised. Caspian did not look at her. He just kept peeling, his pale hands moving quickly. "You do not have to do that," Maya said softly. "I know," Caspian replied, his voice low, "but you have a lot of potatoes." They worked side by side, in a comfortable silence. The only sounds were the scrape of the peelers and Orion's voice behind them. Maya noticed how careful Caspian was. For a man who held so much power, his movements were gentle. She caught the faint scent of rain and pine needles coming from his shirt. When Orion finished his story with a soft chuckle, Caspian looked at Maya. Their eyes met and Caspian smiled. It was a small, genuine smile that completely transformed his face. The cold, distant king vanished, leaving just a man standing in a warm kitchen. Maya felt a sudden flutter in her chest. She realized she was not just cooking for an employer anymore. She was becoming part of this strange, quiet family. Later that night, after Orion went to sleep, Caspian stayed in the kitchen while Maya washed the pots. He picked up a dry towel and started drying the dishes as she washed them. "You brought him back to life," Caspian said. looking at a wet plate in his hands. I did not think it was possible. He just needed to remember that love does not disappear when a person dies, Maya said, turning off the water. It just changes shape. You can still taste it and smell it. Caspian looked down at her. He was much taller, and his pale gray eyes were intense. And what about you, Maya? What do you need? The question hung in the warm air between them, full of an electric tension. Maya looked up at him, her heart beating fast. Before she could answer, the loud ringing of the front doorbell shattered the quiet moment. The outside world had come knocking. The doorbell rang again, loud and demanding. Caspian sighed, his shoulders stiffening as the kingly mask slipped back over his features. He dropped the dish towel on the counter and walked out of the kitchen. Followed a few steps behind him, drying her hands on her apron. Caspian pulled the heavy front door open. A woman stood on the porch, holding an expensive leather bag. She had long, sleek black hair and wore a dark red dress that dragged on the stone floor. Her skin was just as pale as Caspian's, and her eyes were a sharp, cold brown. This was Isabella. She was from an old aristocratic vampire family in the region. Caspian had dated her briefly a year ago, mostly out of political obligation, but they had remained in the same social circles. "Caspian, darling," Isabella said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. She kissed the air near his cheek. She paused and wrinkled her nose in disgust. "Ugh, what is that smell? It smells like roasted garlic and animal fat. Have you turned this estate into a human tavern?" Caspian closed the door. "Hello, Isabella. We are having dinner. Maya is our chef." He gestured toward Maya, who stood quietly near the hallway. Isabella barely looked at Maya. She gave her a quick dismissive glance. "A human cook. How quaint. I came to discuss the zoning lines near the western forest, but I suppose I can stay for a glass of ruby wine while you finish your little human meal." They walked into the formal dining room. Orion was already seated at the head of the long table, waiting for his food. He looked up when Isabella walked in, and his relaxed expression immediately tightened. Isabella was a harsh reminder of the cold, immortal world outside these walls. Maya carried the large ceramic dish into the dining room and set it on the table. It was a rustic chicken bake with thick carrots, potatoes, and a heavy garlic herb sauce. She served a portion onto Orion's plate. Isabella sat down in a chair opposite Orion. She crossed her arms and stared at the food. "Silas told me you were going through a rough patch, Orion," Isabella said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "But eating human food, really? Lyra is gone. It is a tragedy, of course, but human lives are just a brief spark. You are immortal. You need to stop sulking in the past and return to society. This," she waved a hand at the food, "is just sad." The room went dead silent. Orion stopped moving. The small bit of light that had returned to his eyes over the past few weeks vanished instantly. He put his fork down on the table. He looked down at his lap, the weight of his grief crashing back down on him. Caspian felt a surge of cold fury. His hands gripped the edge of the table. He opened his mouth to order Isabella out of his house. But before he could speak, Maya stepped forward. She did not shrink back from the aristocratic vampire. She stood tall, holding the empty serving tray against her apron. "Grief does not care how long you live," Maya said. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the room like a sharp knife. "And love is not a weakness you just get over. This food is not sad. It is a celebration of a woman who filled this cold house with warmth. You do not understand that, because you clearly do not understand love." Isabella gasped. Her brown eyes widened in absolute shock. She stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the wood floor. "How dare you speak to me?" Isabella hissed, showing a flash of sharp teeth. "You are just the help. Caspian, are you going to let a human speak to me this way?" Caspian stood up. He did not look angry. He looked completely calm, which was far more terrifying. He looked at Isabella, and then he looked at Maya. "Maya is right," Caspian said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone. "You understand nothing about this family. You insulted my father in his own home. You insulted the memory of my mother. And you insulted the woman who brought life back to this estate." Isabella stared at him, her mouth opening and closing in disbelief. "Get out, Isabella," Caspian said simply, "and do not come back." Isabella grabbed her leather bag, glared at Maya with pure hatred, and marched out of the dining room. The heavy front door slammed shut behind her. Orion slowly looked up from his lap. He looked at Maya, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "Thank you, my dear," he whispered. Caspian looked at Maya. The tension in the room broke, replaced by a profound sense of clarity. Caspian saw exactly who Maya was. She was brave, she was loyal, and she fought for the people she cared about. She was everything his world lacked. The next morning, the sky over the Maine coast was a brilliant, clear blue. But inside the house, the atmosphere felt fragile. Today was the exact anniversary of Lyra's passing. Maya knew this from a note Martha had left on the kitchen counter the night before. Maya expected the house to revert to its silent, heavy state. She expected Orion to lock himself in his room and Caspian to disappear into his work. She walked into the kitchen at 6 o'clock, preparing to make a quiet, simple breakfast. But the lights were already on. Orion stood by the large counter. He wore a clean blue shirt, and his white hair was neatly combed back. He was holding Lyra's worn recipe book, reading a page carefully. He looked up when Maya walked in and offered a small, brave smile. "Good morning, Maya," Orion said. "Today is a difficult day." But Lyra hated a quiet house. She loved music and she loved food. "So today we are going to make a feast. Every single one of her favorite dishes." Maya felt a rush of warmth in her chest. She tied her apron quickly. "Show me what to do." For the next 6 hours, the kitchen was a whirlwind of activity. Orion guided Maya through the recipes. They made a rich, creamy clam chowder, a large roasted leg of lamb covered in mint sauce, and a massive chocolate cake layered with fresh raspberries. The smells mingled together, filling every corner of the vast stone house with life and celebration. Around 2 o'clock, Caspian walked into the kitchen. He had cancelled all his meetings for the day. He stopped in the doorway, staring at the scene in front of him. His father was covered in a light dusting of flour, laughing at a joke Maya had just made about a misshapen potato. Caspian felt a tight knot in his chest finally release. He walked over, grabbed a knife, and started chopping vegetables without saying a word. They worked as a team. That evening they set the large dining table. Maya did not use the formal crystal glasses. She used the everyday plates Lyra liked. She placed a simple vase of yellow wildflowers in the center of the table. They all sat down together. Orion, Caspian and Maya. Orion raised his glass of water. "To Lyra," he said, his voice steady. "She taught a grumpy old vampire how to live in the light." "To Lyra," Caspian and Maya repeated. Dinner was not sad, it was full of stories. Orion told them about the time Lyra tried to learn how to ski and ended up sliding backward down the entire mountain into a snowbank. He laughed out loud, a deep, rich sound that made the room feel incredibly warm. Caspian smiled, and Maya found herself laughing along with them. It was a perfect evening. After the meal, Orion announced he was tired and walked slowly upstairs to bed. Maya stayed behind to clean up. The kitchen was quiet again. She loaded the plates into the sink, listening to the sound of the running water. The back door that led to the garden was open, letting in the cool night breeze. Caspian stepped out of the shadows and walked over to her. He gently reached out and turned off the water faucet. "Leave the dishes," he said softly. "Walk with me." Maya dried her hands and followed him out the back door. The garden was lit by a bright full moon. The ocean waves crashed softly against the cliffs in the distance. They walked side by side down the stone path until they reached a wooden bench, overlooking the water. Caspian stopped and turned to face her. The moonlight caught his white hair and pale gray eyes. He looked completely human in that moment, vulnerable and open. "I spent the last year thinking my life was over," Caspian said, looking down at her. "I thought I just had to manage the territory and wait for time to pass. I built walls around myself so thick I thought nothing could ever get through." He reached out and gently took both of her hands in his. His skin was still cool, but it felt comforting to her now. "You did not just bring my father back to life, Maya," Caspian said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You brought me back. You showed me that a house is just stone and wood until someone fills it with care. You stood up for my family when no one else would." Maya looked up into his eyes, her heart pounding against her ribs. "I just cooked the food, Caspian." "No," he said, shaking his head slowly. "You cooked the memories and you gave us a future." He leaned down. Maya closed her eyes. His lips met hers in a soft, gentle kiss. It was not a kiss of burning, desperate passion. It was a kiss of deep gratitude, of shared silence, and of a quiet promise. Maya kissed him back, feeling the coldness of his skin melt away under the warmth of her touch. They stood there in the moonlight, holding each other, knowing the long winter in the house was finally over. 2 years passed. The grand stone estate in Maine no longer looked like a dark fortress on a cliff. The heavy curtains in the windows were pulled wide open, letting the bright afternoon sunlight spill across the wooden floors. The silence that used to suffocate the halls was completely gone. Now, the house echoed with the sound of a radio playing soft jazz in the kitchen, and the rapid, uneven tapping of small feet running across the floorboards. The large backyard, which used to be a plain patch of perfectly cut green grass, was transformed. A large wooden fence protected a sprawling vegetable and herb garden. On a bright Tuesday afternoon, Maya stood on the back porch, wiping her hands on a towel. She wore a simple blue dress, and her hair was tied up in a loose knot. She watched the scene in the garden with a soft smile on her face. Orion was kneeling in the dirt. He wore a wide straw hat to block the sun from his pale skin. He looked healthy, vibrant, and totally at peace. He was holding a small silver trowel, digging a small hole in the dark soil. Sitting in the dirt right next to him was a small boy, just over a year old. The boy had wild, dark hair like Maya and striking pale gray eyes like his father. The boy grabbed a handful of dirt and tried to put it in his mouth. "No, little Leo," Orion laughed, catching the boy's hand gently. "We do not eat the dirt. We grow the food in the dirt." Orion picked a fresh basil leaf from a nearby plant, rubbed it between his fingers, and held it to Leo's nose. "Smell this. It smells like a good dinner, doesn't it?" Leo sneezed, and Orion let out a booming laugh. The screen door creaked open behind Maya. Caspian stepped out onto the porch. He was not wearing a suit. He wore dark jeans and a soft gray sweater with the sleeves rolled up. The tight, serious lines that used to frame his face were gone. He looked relaxed. He wrapped his arms around Maya from behind and rested his chin on the top of her head. "He is going to ruin his clothes," Caspian murmured, watching his son dig happily in the mud. "Clothes can be washed," Maya replied, leaning back into his solid chest. She rested one hand over his arms wrapped around her, and the other hand rested on her stomach. It was round and firm. She was expecting their second child in just a few months. Caspian pressed a soft kiss to her hair. He looked out at the garden, at his father laughing in the sun, and at his son discovering the world. He took a deep breath, smelling the salt from the ocean and the fresh herbs from the soil. "I still cannot believe this is real sometimes," Caspian said softly. "I look at this house, and I remember how empty it used to be, how empty I used to be. I hired a cook, and I got a miracle." "You did not get a miracle," Maya said, turning her head to look at him. "You just remembered how to open the door." Caspian smiled. He turned her around fully and kissed her deeply, pulling her close. The coldness that used to define him was entirely gone, replaced by the steady, enduring warmth she had brought into his life. As Maya held on to her husband and listened to the sound of her son, laughing with his grandfather, she let her mind drift. She thought about the journey that had brought her to this windy cliff in Maine. She realized that healing a broken heart never required grand, dramatic gestures or erasing the past. True healing was found in the quiet, simple choices we make every day. It was in the patience of a shared meal, the courage to listen to an old story, and the willingness to let the smell of a baked apple bring a smile instead of a tear. She knew that in the years ahead, life would still bring challenges and moments of doubt. But she also knew that they had built something unbreakable. Love was not about being perfect or immortal. It was about choosing to show up, choosing to care, and choosing to plant seeds in the dirt, trusting that with enough time and warmth, something beautiful would eventually grow. They had turned a house of shadows into a home of light, one simple recipe at a time.